The following is a selection from the novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, presented by ListenToGenius.com, narrated by Dick Hill. There was a dark shadow hanging over Jurgis, as if a savage beast were lurking somewhere in the pathway of his life, and he knew it, and yet could not help approaching the place. There are all stages of being out of work in Packingtown, and he faced in dread the prospect of reaching the lowest. There is a place that waits for the lowest man, the fertilizer plant. The men would talk about it in awe-stricken whispers. Not more than 1 in 10 had ever really tried it. The other 9 had contented themselves with hearsay evidence and a peep through the door. There were some things worse than even starving to death. They would ask Jurgis if he had worked there yet, and if he meant to, and Jurgis would debate the matter with himself. As poor as they were, and making all the sacrifices that they were, would he dare to refuse any sort of work that was offered to him, be it as horrible as ever it could? Would he dare to go home and eat bread that had been earned by Ona, weak and complaining as she was, knowing that he had been given a chance and had not had the nerve to take it? And yet he might argue that way with himself all day, and one glimpse into the fertilizer works would send him away again, shuddering. He was a man, and he would do his duty. He went and made application. But surely he was not also required to hope for success. The fertilizer works of Durham's lay away from the rest of the plant. Few visitors ever saw them, and the few who did would come out looking like Dante, of whom the peasants declared that he had been into hell. To this part of the yards came all the tankage and the waste products of all sorts. Here they dried out the bones, and in suffocating cellars where the daylight never came, you might see men and women and children bending over whirling machines and sawing bits of bone into all sorts of shapes, breathing their lungs full of the fine dust and doomed to die, every one of them, within a certain definite time. Here they made the blood into albumin, and made other foul-smelling things into things still more foul-smelling. In the corridors and caverns where it was done, you might lose yourself as in the great caves of Kentucky. In the dust and the steam, the electric lights would shine like far-off twinkling stars, red and blue-green and purple stars, according to the color of the mist and the brew from which it came. For the odors of these ghastly charnel houses, there may be words in Lithuanian, but there are none in English. The person entering would have to summon his courage as for a cold water plunge. He would go in like a man swimming underwater. He would put his handkerchief over his face and begin to cough and choke. And then, if he were still obstinate, he would find his head beginning to ring, and the veins in his forehead to throb, until finally he would be assailed by an overpowering blast of ammonia fumes and would turn and run for his life and come out half-dazed. On top of this were the rooms where they dried the tankage, the mass of brown, stringy stuff that was left after the waste portions of the carcasses had had the lard and tallow dried out of them. This dried material they would then grind to a fine powder, and after they had mixed it up well with a mysterious but inoffensive brown rock which they brought in and ground up by the hundreds of carloads for that purpose, the substance was ready to be put into bags and sent out to the world as any one of 100 different brands of standard bone phosphate. And then the farmer in Maine or California or Texas would buy this at, say, $25 a ton and plant it with his corn. And for several days after the operation, the fields would have a strong odor, and the farmer and his wagon and the very horses that had hauled it would all have it, too. In Packingtown, the fertilizer is pure instead of being a flavoring. And instead of a ton or so spread out on several acres under the open sky, there are hundreds and thousands of tons of it in one building, heaped here and there in haystack piles, covering the floor several inches deep and filling the air with a choking dust that becomes a blinding sandstorm when the wind stirs. It was to this building that Jurgis came daily, as if dragged by an unseen hand. The month of May was an exceptionally cool one, and his secret prayers were granted. But early in June there came a record-breaking hot spell, and after that there were men wanted in the fertilizer mill. The boss of the grinding room had come to know Jurgis by this time, and had marked him for a likely man. And so when he came to the door about 2 o'clock this breathless, hot day, he felt a sudden spasm of pain shoot through him. The boss beckoned to him. In 10 minutes more, Jurgis had pulled off his coat and overshirt and set his teeth together and gone to work. Here was one more difficulty for him to meet and conquer. His labor took him about 1 minute to learn. Before him was one of the vents of the mill in which the fertilizer was being ground, rushing forth in a great brown river, with a spray of the finest dust flung forth in clouds. Jurgis was given a shovel, and along with half a dozen others, it was his task to shovel this fertilizer into carts. That others were at work he knew by the sound, and by the fact that he sometimes collided with them. Otherwise they might as well have not been there, for in the blinding dust storm a man could not see 6 feet in front of his face. When he had filled one cart, he had to grope around him until another came, and if there was none on hand, he continued to grope till one arrived. In 5 minutes he was, of course, a mass of fertilizer from head to feet. They gave him a sponge to tie over his mouth so that he could breathe, but the sponge did not prevent his lips and eyelids from caking up with it, and his ears from filling solid. He looked like a brown ghost at twilight. From hair to shoes, he became the color of the building and of everything in it, and for that matter 100 yards outside it. The building had to be left open, and when the wind blew, Durham and Company lost a great deal of fertilizer. Working in his shirt sleeves, and with the thermometer at over 100, the phosphates soaked in through every pore of Jurgis's skin. And in 5 minutes he had a headache, and in 15 was almost dazed. The blood was pounding in his brain like an engine's throbbing. There was a frightful pain in the top of his skull, and he could hardly control his hands. Still, with the memory of his 4 months' siege behind him, he fought on, in a frenzy of determination, and half an hour later he began to vomit. He vomited until it seemed as if his inwards must be torn into shreds. A man could get used to the fertilizer mill, the boss had said, if he would make up his mind to it. But Jurgis now began to see that it was a question of making up his stomach. At the end of that day of horror, he could scarcely stand. He had to catch himself now and then, and lean against a building and get his bearings. Most of the men, when they came out, made straight for a saloon. They seemed to place fertilizer and rattlesnake poison in one class. But Jurgis was too ill to think of drinking. He could only make his way to the street and stagger onto a car. He had a sense of humor, and later on, when he became an old hand, he used to think it fun to board a streetcar and see what happened. Now, however, he was too ill to notice it, how the people in the car began to gasp and sputter, to put their handkerchiefs to their noses and transfix him with furious glances. Jurgis only knew that a man in front of him immediately got up and gave him a seat, and that half a minute later the two people on each side of him got up, and that in a full minute the crowded car was nearly empty, those passengers who could not get room on the platform having gotten out to walk. Of course, Jurgis had made his home a miniature fertilizer mill a minute after entering. The stuff was half an inch deep in his skin. His whole system was full of it, and it would have taken a week not merely of scrubbing but of vigorous exercise to get it out of him. As it was, he could be compared with nothing known to men, save that newest discovery of the savants, a substance which emits energy for an unlimited time without being itself in the least diminished in power. He smelled so that he made all the food at the table taste and set the whole family to vomiting. For himself, it was 3 days before he could keep anything upon his stomach. He might wash his hands and use a knife and fork, but were not his mouth and throat filled with the poison? And still, Jurgis stuck it out. In spite of splitting headaches, he would stagger down to the plant and take up his stand once more and begin to shovel in the blinding clouds of dust. And so at the end of the week, he was a fertilizer man for life. He was able to eat again, and though his head never stopped aching, it ceased to be so bad that he could not work. This is Dick Hill for ListenToGenius.com. Thank you for listening. This audio program is copyrighted by Redwood Audiobooks. Permission is granted to download for personal use only, not for distribution or commercial use.